Great. So it's already 3 p.m. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Gary in Auckland. It is our privilege and a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Gary Barkhuizen, a globally recognized scholar in the field of applied linguistics, whose work continues to shape and inspire the international academic landscape. Professor Barkhuizen is based at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, where he serves as Professor of Applied Linguistics. His extensive teaching and research career spans multiple countries and contexts with a sustained focus on language teacher education, teacher and learner identity, study abroad, and the transformative methodology of narrative inquiry. His scholarly contributions in these areas are reflected in a prolific body of work that have had a significant and lasting impact on the field. Among his influential publications are Narrative Research in Applied Linguistics, published in 2013, Reflections on Language Teacher Identity Research, Qualitative Research Topics in Language Teacher Education, 2019, Language Teacher Education Identity, Narrative Inquiry in Language Teaching and Learning Research, among others. Professor Barkhuizen's pioneer work on narrative methods has offered researchers powerful tools to explore the personal and professional experiences of language teachers and learners. His research consistently highlights the complex, lived realities of language educators, particularly in intercultural and global contexts. In recognition of his outstanding contributions to research, Professor Barkhuizen received the TESOL International Association's Award for Distinguished Research in 2017. He was also named among the top 2% of scientists worldwide in applied linguistics and language education by Stanford University in 2022. This honor reflects not only the depth of his academic contributions, but also their far-reaching influence. On a personal level, I am deeply grateful to Professor Barkhuizen for accepting my invitation to speak at this event. It means a great deal to all of us. Beyond his academic brilliance, Gary is known for his warmth, generosity, and humility, qualities that make him not just an esteemed scholar, but a truly exceptional human being. Thank you very much, Gary, for being here with us today and for continuing to inspire so many through your work and presence. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gary Barkhuizen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. Wow, I wish I could listen to someone like that today. It's unbelievable. I hope you can all hear me okay. Good. One of the problems I always have is sharing my screen, but I'm going to try do that right now. Let me have a go. Sharing my screen 2. I think you can see that. What I want to do next over here. Let's just have a look. Okay. Are you able to see my screen there? All right.
Not yet, but we can wait. Take your time.
Oh, you can't see my screen? Oh, okay. Let me try again. It says that Share screen.
There you go.
That's not
Going
the one I
on.
want to. That's not the one I want to share. Hang on, hang on,
Oh,
hang on. Let me have another go here. Just give me a minute.
sure.
Just give me a second.
Yes.
I think you can see it now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Okay, right, excellent. Let me get going then. So if you see what's up on the screen there, firstly, thank you for that introduction. That was absolutely wonderful. And buenos dias from New Zealand. Good morning from New Zealand. It's just after 9 o'clock in the morning. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be back in Guanajuato. I was there a few years ago at a conference. I had the most fantastic time. I really enjoyed it, met some wonderful people that I'm still in contact with in many, many ways. So it's really great to be back, and I'm really pleased to be talking about my favorite subject, narrative inquiry. But I'm using narrative inquiry today as an introduction to talk about something else I've become extremely passionate about, and this is the case method pedagogy in language teacher education. Now, the case method pedagogy has been used a lot in in law and business. It's famous from the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Law School, where cases are used for pedagogical purposes to train lawyers and to train people at the business school. It's also used in many other disciplines, in medicine, and so on, many other professions. So I've recently become very interested in how we can use these cases in language teacher education. And of course, the cases are stories, they are narratives that we use in language teacher education, and therefore the strong link, the crossover with the work that I do in narrative inquiry. So I want to show you how narrative inquiry led me into this interest in case method pedagogy. So I hope there's some language teacher educators in the audience today, as well as some researchers. So that will sort of satisfy both audiences. What I also want to do is I want to go quite quickly so that we can leave some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So now, sorry, I'm still having issues with the screen sharing here.
No problem.
I need to stop it again. It's not moving. I'm sorry about this. It's not
No problem.
moving.
Alternatively, if you share it with us, with me, or I don't know, we can share it for you.
I'm going to have one more go, and then I may just do that. Give me one more go, and then okay, give me one more go. I'm nearly there. It's strange. It's sharing on my screen, but it's not sharing on the shared screen. Look,
We can see it now.
hang on. You can see it.
Yes, and it's moving. Yes.
Okay, good, good, good. So, all right. So let me start then with this screen that you can see here. That's one of the things I always get wrong for some reason, sharing the screen. I had a rehearsal about, 10 minutes before we started and everything worked well. And then when I'm doing it here, it doesn't work. Anyway, here we go. So what happened many years ago when I moved to New Zealand, I came from South Africa and I moved to New Zealand and I got involved in a research project where I was interested in looking at the lives of immigrants who had moved from South Africa to New Zealand. I wanted to see how they experienced this transition in their lives, this move from the change in their identities as they moved from South Africa to New Zealand, particularly their language identities, because the people I was focusing on were bilingual Afrikaans English-speaking immigrants. Afrikaans is one of the national languages in South Africa. And so what I did was, I'm not going to all the details of the study, but the aim was to investigate their language and identity experiences as they move from one country to another country. So over a number of months, I interviewed 28 participants from the top of the country all the way right up north over there, all the way down to the south of the country. And I did one interview with each participant that lasted a couple of hours. And I ended up, therefore, with 28 interviews that focused on identity, their language learning, both English and Afrikaans, and their language use. So I ended up, as you can see in this slide, 28 interviews. Let's say here we've got interview 1, then we've got interview 2, and all the way to interview number 28. I ended up with these 28 interviews. And so I started to transcribe the interviews one by one. I was listening to the transcriptions, analyzing the transcriptions. And what I actually found was that in the interviews, they were really telling me a story of their lives, the story of this move from one country to another country. So I really became interested in this idea of narrative and how can we use narrative to find out about my research questions that I had. How can I use story to investigate in more depth how these people experienced this identity and language move from one country to another country. So I looked at the interview as one whole story. But what I also noticed when dealing with these interviews was that embedded within an interview were these smaller stories, these shorter stories, because often in the interview, you'll ask a question and you'll get an answer. You ask a question, you get an answer. No, there are no stories. But every now and then you ask a question and then you get a lovely story as the answer. And sometimes you would end up with 2 or more or a whole lot of stories in any one interview. And so I discovered narrative inquiry that, of course, had been happening in many other disciplines, particularly general education, and in anthropology, sociology, psychotherapy, and so on. So I was hooked on this idea that stories can be so powerful for us as researchers to learn in great detail about the participants' experiences from their perspective. So I started reading and doing more analysis and collecting more data and became much more familiar with this idea of narrative inquiry. So story became really, really important in trying to understand people's experiences of the lives they live and the lives they have lived and also the lives that they imagine. Story became really important. So narrative inquiry then has as its central concern the stories that narrators tell about their life experiences, the stories that they tell about their life experiences. 2 important concepts there. We've got the stories and about their life experiences, right? That's what narrative inquiry is really about. But it's much more than just telling stories. If we were just telling stories, that wouldn't really be much research going on there. We'd just be telling stories and having fun. But narrative inquiry is also about making meaning of life experiences in the process of telling those stories. So you've got telling stories about life experiences and making meaning of those stories that we tell, understanding those life experiences. Very, very important. Okay, so that's the overall idea, the way I see narrative, that those three things have to be happening all the time. We are living and imagining experiences, we tell stories about them, and through the telling of stories, we make meaning of those experiences. Not only the storyteller, but also the audience of that storytelling, which is the researcher in our case. I've referred to that concept as narrative knowledging, because we understanding, we are knowledging, it's a verb in the process of telling and listening to stories. I guess we need to say, what do we mean by story? And of course, different cultures have different ideas about what stories are. Different socioeconomic groups see stories in different ways. Linguists analyze this, and sociolinguists have, and seen that stories are organized differently from a discourse perspective, depending on different cultural groups, even different genders. And we even tell stories differently on different occasions and depending on who the audience is. Nevertheless, I have my idea about story, which I think is fairly common from the sort of discipline that I work in, particularly the sort of educational, sort of Western discipline that I work in. But I'm sure you may have perhaps different perspectives on what story means. But for me, story, what stories do is that they narrate experiences from the past and the imagined future. I've already mentioned that. It's about narrating experience. But they also include reflective or evaluative commentary on those experiences. So it's not just talking about the experiences, what happened, not I did this, I did that, but including some reflection on what you did or some commentary on those experiences, how you felt, your emotions about the experiences that you felt. They also have a time dimension. So, something happens over time, a temporal dimension. In literature, we refer to the plot, right? So things happen. If you watch a movie with a lovely story, things happen over time. There's some action. They embody action. Something happens in the story over time. It's not like a shopping list. If you go to the grocery store and you have to buy cabbage, milk, coffee, tea, sausages, right? That's a shopping list. There's no action there. With the story, there's some action that happens over time. And stories always make reference to the characters or who is involved in the story. In the story world, the characters in the story world, how they relate to each other, how they position themselves vis-a-vis each other, what their relationships are, their power differences as they interact with each other in the story. And when the action takes place, this is, again, the time dimension, important in stories. And then, of course, where the story takes place, the setting, the physical setting, but also the social spaces in which the action takes place, such as a classroom. And if we think of a classroom, it's not just a physical classroom, but there are people in the classroom interacting in social spaces and with material objects in a technological world. So the where includes technology and digital spaces and material objects, right, in the classrooms and schools and communities and so on. So for me, when I think of story, and I think as narrative inquirers, we should always say what we mean by story when we are doing a narrative inquiry. Sometimes I read an article, for example, that says a narrative inquiry on this topic. And then I read the article and I think, is this really a narrative inquiry? Where's the story? I can't see the story there. I like to see a story, and I like the authors to tell me what they mean by story. Then I'm more convinced that it is, in fact, narrative inquiry. in this book chapter I wrote for the Routledge Handbook of Research Methods, I wrote the chapter on 5 core dimensions of narrative inquiry. And I enjoyed writing this because what I did was I tried to break down this vast field of narrative inquiry in our field in applied linguistics. It's very complex. There's so many different perspectives on collecting data, on analyzing data, on how you report the findings. And, you know, I've got 30 minutes, but we could spend hours talking about this. We could do a whole semester course on narrative inquiry. But what I tried to do in this chapter was to break it down to 5 core dimensions that that always remind me of what the basics of narrative inquiry are. Now, I'm not going to go through all 5, but I want to go to 2 of them because I think these are important for understanding the basics of narrative inquiry. So I want to go into these 2, and then that will lead me on to the case method pedagogy in teacher education. Okay, so the first one, and it's dimension number 5, so I'm going right to the end, and then I'll come back to an earlier one. This is one of the main distinctions. Well, I say distinction, but I've got it as a continuum over here. This is a dimension. So nothing happens at this end distinctly or that end, but it moves along this continuum, right? So on the left side here, we got what Donald Polkinghorne calls analysis of narratives, analysis of narratives. And this is the conventional thematic or content analysis, and involves searching or coding data for themes and then categorizing the themes and looking for patterns of how these themes relate to each other, how they're associated with each other. This is the thematic analysis of qualitative research that I think many of us are familiar with. But here, of course, we're looking at the analysis of stories. So we're looking at the stories we collect and then sort of ripping them apart by trying to say, what are the themes here in the story? So this is more towards the left side of this dimension. And we do this all the time in narrative inquiry. If you read 10 articles that are claimed to be narrative inquiry articles, I bet you 7 or 8 of them will probably be doing a thematic analysis, which will be this left-hand side of this dimension. On the right-hand side, we get what is called narrative analysis. And this is where you configure your data content, the data that you've got, into a coherent storied whole. So in other words, the outcome of your analysis is a story. So you write a story based on your data. So the researcher turns the data into a story. Now, the story that you write may be constructed from stories that you've collected or even from non-story data. So, for example, if you do an interview with 3 or 4 people and the answers they give you are not really stories, you can still write a story based on that interview data. So this is towards the right-hand side, narrative analysis, configuring the data that you've got, whether it's story form or not story form, into a story. And you could even then do further thematic analysis on those stories that you have. So you could start, in fact, some data analysis, doing thematic analysis to get some themes from your stories. Then you could configure those stories into another story, and maybe you've done 10 interviews, then you would have 10 stories. You could then do some thematic analysis on those 10 stories. So there's no formula, right? You can move along this dimension back and forth. Let me just show you. A few years ago, I spent time at a university when I was on sabbatical in Africa, where they asked me to teach an intensive graduate course. There were only 2 students in the class that needed to finish off their degree. So they needed to do a course. And I said I would teach one intensively over a month. And what I got them to do, the three of us, we thought we'd spend a month together. We would write stories about our experiences of teaching, of being in teacher education, of learning language and so on. So we would write a narrative every second day or every third day. And what we noticed from the narratives we were writing, and also from our reading that we were doing in teacher education, language teacher education, was that the word tensions or dilemmas kept popping up. It became evident that the idea of tensions in teacher education was an important theme. So we started to look, we continued writing the narratives, but started to look at our narratives that we were generating for any evidence of tensions in our practices that we had written about in our narratives. And look at this nice little story that Roxanne wrote in one of the narratives. She says, when I got a part-time job as a lecturer, this is to teach a first-year course, I entered into a new phase of learning to become a language teacher because it was a different experience for me compared to what I was used to as a high school teacher. I had a more mature group of students from an entirely different cultural background, more numerous in number than each of the classes I had previously taught. It was quite challenging at first. So quite challenging. She's indicating a tension here in terms of her practices when she moved from being a high school teacher to a teacher at college, at university. So a nice little story that she tells that has to do with her practices. So this idea of her practices being a theme here in terms of the tension she experienced, the teacher experienced operating in a school. Okay, so we've got some data at the bottom, some story data. We got a theme here to do with her practices. And if you add this practices to other themes, which I'll show you right now, they together, group them together in a category of tensions between the teacher and the school. So here we've got practices over here. Other tensions that the teacher can experience with the school have to do with the mission and values of the school, other teachers in the school, the policies of the school, administration management, and the status of the ESL program. These were some of the tensions that we discovered in the narratives that we were writing. So these themes, these tension themes here, all together, the themes made up this category of tensions between the teacher and the school. And we discovered other categories. Over here, for example, I've put it in diagrammatic form for you. So we've got here the teacher in the middle and tensions with the school. This is the one I've just discussed. There were tensions with the learners. There were tensions with the resources that were available. There were tensions with the curriculum, with the community, and even with the broader macro level of the state. And each of these categories have their themes, all right? So this is a nice example, easy example of analysis of narratives, which is on the left-hand side here of dimension 5. Okay, I hope you all follow that. Now, if we move to the right-hand side, where we look at narrative analysis, I won't read this whole thing, but this is just an example of some narrative analysis. This is with a PhD student of mine who is now a professor in Japan. This was based on her PhD. We wrote an article for a local journal here in New Zealand. And what we did in the article was we selected 2 of her participants. And in presenting the findings, we wrote 2 stories about these participants. So this is narrative analysis. Her study was about immigrants from Japan who left Japan as immigrants after the Fukushima nuclear disaster from 2011. And after that, they felt unsafe in Japan and immigrated to New Zealand. And she was interested in that settlement process, resettlement in New Zealand, and their identity and their language learning in New Zealand as a result of leaving Japan because of that disaster. And she used Bonnie Norton's investment model as the theoretical framework to analyze her data. So what we did what she did in her thesis and what we did in this article was to construct, here we did 2 stories. We wrote these 2 stories, but they are not just summarizing their life experiences. Doing narrative analysis, constructing these stories is actually very difficult because you're doing 3 things. You're reporting on their experiences. Of course you are. You're telling about their experiences. But you're also focusing on your research question, which is about here, identity and language learning. And you also drawing on relevant theory. So, and in this case, it's Bonnie Norton's model of investment. So you've got theory and you've got the experiences of the participants to focus on, as well as focusing on your topic. So the stories you write are not just telling their story. They are research stories, right? Research texts, as Clannon and Connolly would call them. So you can see how nicely the story moves along. After resigning from his job and moving to be with his wife and child away from the Fukushima disaster had occurred, where the Fukushima occurred, Yuichi settled easily into his nice story flowing, right? End of the paragraph. He eventually had to compromise and the family left Japan. This is the immigrant story. So we are focusing on his experience. In the middle of the second paragraph here, he said, we say, first he attended an English school for 6 months and fulfilled the English language requirement for admission to a polytechnic. Here he is investing in English language learning. So a clear example of how we drawing on Norton's model of investment and making sure we're including it in the story, right? A little later, he said, however, shortly after beginning to work, he was quick to notice that something was not quite right. The attitude and values that were expected in the workplace. This is when he started to work. So now there's a problem here in his story. So we've got this dilemma in his story relating to his identity, because his identity in Japan was one of a hard worker who worked for himself and the company. But here he found that the working environment was quite informal, and this clashed with his formal work identity. So we were focusing on identity. We're including his own words. When I was in Japan, I used to think that as long as you do a good job, nothing else mattered. This quote at the end. So a lovely story, our interpretation, drawing on the theory, drawing on the data, including excerpts of data. And then, of course, the story continues for about 1,000 words, right? So a nice example of narrative analysis. I want to quickly move on to the second dimension here. And this is a dimension that focuses on interaction, because a lot of narrative inquiry work is about interaction, either conversation, interviews. Of course, there's other types of narrative work, looking at teacher journals, language learner histories, and so on. But much of it is about interaction. On the left side of this dimension, we have stories as interaction. So here, researchers focus on how the stories take shape interactionally. So this is where, for example, storytelling as doing social actions is the focus, such as constructing identity. So you look at the language, at the discourse, to see how identities are performed line by line, action by action in the storytelling process. And of course, this would be attractive for the work of discourse analysts and conversation analysts. So here, this is stories as interaction. The stories are the interaction, right? So you want to see how people perform their identities, for example, or how they perform particular attitudes or perspectives as they are interacting. And so the conversation analyst would look at the language and look at the turn taking and look at the interrupting, the overlaps, to show the identity being performed in the interaction. So I've called this, and others too, stories as interaction. This is not mainly the work I do. I'm focused mainly on the other side, which is stories from interaction. So this is where stories are extracted from interaction, from conversations, from interviews, and then analyzed for their content, focusing on the themes and the content. So analyzed text is extracted from the interactional data, interviews, conversations, and then analyzed as interaction. I mean, and then analyzed as content rather than as interaction. So let me just show you an example. So this is stories as interaction, the excellent work by Matt Pryor and Steve Talmy use this approach. So you don't have to read this, but just look at the transcript. You can see a very detailed transcript. Line 13 here, and the laugh is included. I was like, well, I need even a little indication of the stress on the need to have 0.4 of a second pause, Monday to Friday, and then a overlapping, and so on, another pause, more overlapping interruptions, very detailed, showing how these two pre-service teachers are discussing the competitive job market and indicating their own perspective and their fears and anxieties and emotions relating to the competitive job market for English language teachers. So they're showing these emotions in action in the unfolding of this talk. So it's there in the interaction, all right, showing how it unfolds step by step, word by word, pause by pause in the interaction. Whereas stories from interaction is where you get an excerpt from the interview in this case. So we don't need to read this, but this is a teacher educator who is commenting on how he sees himself, his identity as a teacher educator. I'm a person who is interested in the students. Look at the transcript, very broad, no ums, no ors, no pauses. Why? Because we're focusing on the content of what the teacher educator is saying. I'm looking for the themes here rather than how the teacher educator is performing his identity. I want to see what he says about his identity. They are starting doing the majors just without understanding what they are studying, he says in line 7. And it really concerns me. It really worries me because they are going to be teachers and they are going to replicate those feelings in other people. So he's concerned about these pre-service teachers studying to be teachers, but they don't know what they're getting into. They haven't really thought about why they want to be teachers. And this concerns him, and this drives him in his work as a teacher educator. Okay, so stories in interaction, stories from interaction, and then the previous dimension was analysis of narratives, how we do thematic and content analysis, and then the constructing the stories, which is narrative analysis. Now, you can see from these examples that I've given you, these broad examples of narrative inquiry, how important stories are because they help us to understand the experiences of the teachers or the participants, the language learners who are telling us about the stories, about the experiences that they have lived. Stories are powerful means of articulating and constructing and displaying and performing one's experiences. And that's why they are so powerful. I have found years ago, I taught a course on leadership and management. It's not an inspiring course for me to teach. Nevertheless, I ended up having to teach it. And it was quite a big class. And we used to wade through the content of the students, mainly senior students, master's level, were never particularly engaged. But when I would tell them a story about management, they tended to perk up and they tended to show a little bit more interest in what was going on. So what I did was I invented some vignettes. I made them up. about a dilemma in the workplace or a dilemma in leadership. And we would look at these cases, these vignettes in class, and analyze it. What would you do if this happened? Why do you think this happened? How would you change this? What would be better if that happened? And this used to engage the students much more than looking at another bullet point list of strategies for improving the communication in the department, for example. So I found those little vignettes to be quite encouraging. And so in the last few years, I've been working with cases, or the case method, in language teacher education in my courses. What is the case method in language teacher education? I gave a little hint right at the beginning when I said that in law and business and so on, they use these real cases as a way to drive the curriculum and to engage the professionals to think like professionals. So case-based pedagogy is a means of developing teacher thinking and attitudes and beliefs about issues in the field. Language teachers practicing it are not passive recipients of theories, principles, and strategies. So they don't just sit back and the teacher educator feeds them theories, tells them how to teach, but rather they're much more active by analyzing and working on cases. So the case method instruction illustrates these theoretical principles in the case, illustrates them rather than tells you what they are. They pose moral and ethical dilemmas that you need to work on, provide alternative images of practice, different ways of practicing in the case that you can then reflect on and think about. And it encourages thinking like a teacher. So what is a case? A case is a description of an actual or a hypothetical yet realistic real-world situation in which a person or persons face a problem or challenge. It's like a story. It's a narrative or a story or a situation that present provocative issues or problems or questions. These cases can be long, they could be a number of pages, or they can be short. A vignette like I used in my management course. They can be completed narratives, so they tell a story with a happy ending, or they can be stories that are unresolved, that are dilemma-based. There's an issue, a problem that needs to be solved, or a story without an ending. So there are different forms, different shapes, a wide variety of these cases. The cases could be written by an instructor, or they can be written by students, or they could be in a published casebook. So you could get a language teacher education casebook, or you could get a legal casebook, or they could be written by AI. I've had an attempt at doing that. I'll tell you about if we have some time. So let me show you an example. So when I introduce a case in class, I give some keywords to orient the students to the case. So here's some keywords. You can see it's set in the United Kingdom. It's a postgrad student from China. There's an MA TESOL dissertation that she's involved in. She's got to choose a topic. And the topic idea versus knowledge of methods. This is the dilemma you can see there. So I also give some pre-reading reflection. So there's some questions that are not directly related to the case, but they're similar in topic. Now, have you done research before? If yes, what was your topic? So you see these reflection, pre-reading reflections are related to the case. In what ways might teachers' research findings be useful? That related to the case. So the cases I've been using are about 600 words long, 650 words long. So I'll just show you a brief summary of this case. Ing is an international student studying at a university in London. She's completed all the coursework for her MA in TESOL and is now time to begin her 15,000-word dissertation, the final component of her degree. She needs to decide on a topic. Ing comes from China. I'm giving some background here. After finishing her BA, she taught English for 2 years in informal contexts. She became excited about studying further, realizing that she probably needed a PhD to get a full-time position as a college English teacher in China, and so on and so on. Then there's another section which describes how she got a place on a MA TESOL in the UK. She did coursework, which all included some research activities, also did a research methods course. There's, in the case, describes how she has some questions about qualitative research because her undergrad program focused on quantitative research. So she's a bit unsure about what this qualitative research means, right? Towards the end of the case, Ing says she wants the topic of her dissertation to be relevant to her future college English teaching work back in China. She also wants the findings to be useful in some way. She has a few topics in mind um, that are based on the courses that she did. So things to do with identity and policy and so on. And these are courses that she feels require a qualitative type of methodology. But she prefers the quantitative type of methodology. So she's this dilemma. Should I go qualitative where the nice topics are, or should I go quantitative, which is a methodology I feel more at home with? Now, she's got to meet at the end here. As far as Ing can figure out, these broad topics appear more suitable to qualitative research. At the end, she needs to choose a topic soon. After doing so, she will meet with a supervisor assigned to her who specializes in the research methods appropriate for her topic. End of case. So there's this dilemma. I've got to choose, I've got to meet my supervisor, and the supervisor is going to be the specialist in the research method, and I haven't chosen my topic yet, right? So you've got a dilemma. After the dilemma, there's a set of questions. I won't read these, but just look at the last one. How would you advise Ing about choosing her topic before meeting her supervisor? So the other questions are based on, the case, her background, her experience. But the case also gets you to think, how would you advise her? What would you do? And then you draw on the case to advise her based on what the content of the case is. Thinking like a teacher educator is what the case aims to do. So cases are used in different ways. There's the strong version where it's like a case-oriented curriculum. The case drives the curriculum. So you have a set of cases and then you design the curriculum around those cases. It's sort of strong version of case method pedagogy. This is the way I tend to use them, where I've got my curriculum or my course, and then I bring in cases every now and then to reinforce a topic, to talk more about a particular issue we may have discussed. So the cases sort of come in at strategic points along the course or syllabus that is already designed beforehand. So the course takes precedent and the cases come in at strategic times. The cases could also be used in a workshop, professional development workshop, or a course, in a more ad hoc way, as a icebreaker, or develop group cohesion as a time filler, or just as a one-off instructional activity. So, often you think, oh God, what am I going to do today? All right, let me do a case, just as a filler of some sort. So what are the benefits of cases? You can see this on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of these, but, relating the case to one's personal experience. So, and what this also says, relating it to a context that someone's familiar with. So the case may be set in the UK, or the case may be set in Mexico, but someone studying in a different context would try and say, how can I use that content in my context? So it's trying to make sense of it, relating to your personal experience, to your context, and of course, always relating it to the curriculum that you are studying, the course that you are studying. What Johnson and Garbeck refer to as externalizing everyday concepts. So making what you already know external, and then internalizing the scientific concepts or the academic concepts. So it's like sort of relating theory to practice in some way, drawing on what you know to make sense of the case, but also learning about the theory and the concepts in the case. A list of other benefits include, providing opportunity for critical reflective practice, collaborating in groups, critical thinking, because a lot of the discussion and answering the questions takes place in groups. The cases I use are all dilemma-based. I've written a lot of cases are dilemma-based narrative cases. They're all narratives, they're all stories, they've got characters, there's a temporal dimension. As I said earlier, when talking about narratives and stories, there's action in physical places. The stories are all hypothetical. They're not based on real experiences. I have invented them, the ones I use, I make them up, but based on my own personal experience, my research, my readings, and so on. They are all dilemma-based, as I've said. The cases end with an unresolved dilemma or with an unfinished story. And the characters are grappling with a dilemma, with something that needs to be sorted out, like Ing needs to decide on a topic before she sees her supervisor. So there's always something that needs to be sorted out at the end. The cases are context rich. There's a lot of background information in the characters, the places, the action. That needs to be there so that there's a lot to work on when you are grappling with the case, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand the narrator in the case's experience. Let's have a look at this case, just for another example. This is set in Mexico. And here we have a university researcher who is a language teacher educator in both Spanish and English. And this researcher feels that he's forced to publish in English, and he has concerns about inequity in scholarly dissemination. He feels, why should he be publishing all the time in English? So it starts off with Harold Rodriguez, is an up-and-coming scholar of both English and Spanish, teacher education at a reputable university, nestled in the heart of Mexico. After graduating with his PhD from the same university where he now works, he has been involved in teacher education for nearly 10 years. His journey into academia was driven by a desire to bridge the gap between theory and practice in language education. But in his pursuit of academic excellence, Dr. Rodriguez has conducted some innovative research and has reported on his findings in articles and scholarly journals. He's also presented his work at conferences, and his work encompasses a wide range of topics that are relevant to teacher education, like identity and innovative pedagogies. But the dilemma, this is 600 words. I'm just summarizing it for you. The dilemma Dr. Rodriguez faces is multifaceted. While publishing in English journals grants him access to a global audience and enhances his academic reputation, it also perpetuates a systemic imbalance in scholarly dissemination. As a Spanish-speaking educator based in Mexico, Dr. Rodriguez laments the inequity of a publishing landscape dominated by English language publications. He believes that valuable insights from Spanish-speaking scholars often go unnoticed, as their work remains inaccessible to non-English speaking audiences. And it goes on a little bit longer. But that's the dilemma. That's what Harold is suffering from at this moment. That's his grappling dilemma. And there's a number of questions. But look at this last, number 5. What would you suggest Dr. Rodriguez does to advocate for greater inclusivity within the language teacher education community in Mexico regarding the dissemination of research in multiple languages, considering the challenges and constraints he faces? So a nice dilemma that can be discussed a lot. There's 5 questions, a lot that can be discussed there. I want you just in about 5 minutes, just talk a little bit about how I've been using the cases in my courses. These are 2 courses. One is 757, which is a master's course on research, and 734, which is a master's course on identity. And I've been using these courses for assignments, as well as in-class discussions and online discussions. I use the platform Canvas, the learning management system. So I use them for assignments where they analyze cases and they submit their analysis, and various other forms of working with cases. The in-class discussions take multiple forms, either as a whole class, or they do it in groups, and then first groups, then as a whole class. Sometimes they do it in groups and then present to the class. There are multiple forms of analyzing the cases. And then the online discussions, they post their answers, and then people reply to their answers from the cases, and you get the discussion going. So what I did was, as part of a exploratory action research project to see how the cases work, I designed a questionnaire to see how my students found this over a whole course of a year, over 2 courses. So I had a 20-item questionnaire using Qualtrics, which I gave at the beginning and the end of each semester for these 2 courses. I got ethics approval for it. And in one of the courses, we interviewed some students. So just very quickly, this was using the cases in the research course. We got 19 responses. And this is how the cases help raise the awareness of students' research in the course. And if you look at the graphs here, this has to do with the assignment, using the cases in the assignment, 12 and all 19, in fact, to a great extent and quite a lot. So there's quite a positive response. For the in-class discussions, here, 19 as well, a little less enthusiastically here. And for the online discussion, there was also a positive response. Just again, the in-class group collaboration, they, for one of the in-class discussions, you first worked in small groups and before engaging in whole class discussion. For the other in-class discussion, you discussed as though, which did you prefer? They preferred doing it in small groups rather than whole class discussion. And the reason here is in small groups, they felt they don't like talking in front of the whole class. And in small groups, they could also, they have a little bit more confidence by talking with each other. As they say, it helps me confirm and enrich. They enjoy talking to it. I'll just skip that one. And I'll skip that one. But overall, they say that it helped them better understand their research. You know, out of the 17, mainly on the positive side. So again, did it help them reflect on their experience as a teacher? Mainly on the positive side. I'm just trying to show that this did seem to, have some benefits for the teachers from their perspective, but in a very exploratory sort of way. This was one of the just have a look at the words in red. This is one of the teachers. These dilemmas, to look at them from another perspective, looking at teaching from another perspective, which they hadn't thought of, more conscious and think more deeply about issues. I started to think about myself. I restarted thinking about myself. Lovely. The transition from unconsciousness to consciousness. That was nice. I mean, it's interesting way it's being put, but starting to reflect consciously about being a teacher. I'll skip that. Oh, no, some of the limitations, I'll just leave this up here, so just for the sake of the recording anyway. What's interesting is that the cases are not that easy to use because they take a lot of time and it takes a lot of practice for the teacher educator. So I thought, let me just mention this limitation. It's not all rosy. It's not all fabulous. They do take a little bit of time to practice using them. But certainly, I think the benefits outweigh these minimal limitations here. I wanted to just say, just to end off here, that I've just written this language teacher education casebook, which will be coming out in a little later this year by Cambridge University Press. There's the cover, which has just been out, just been published recently. The book has a number of sections. The first one introduces the case method, saying what the case method is, which is what I was saying today. The second one introduces the cases, outlining what the cases are and what the content is. And then section 3 gives guidelines for the teacher, educators, and facilitators of workshops, very specific guidelines for how to use the cases. And then in section 4 are 70 cases in 10 chapters. So from classroom language teaching, cases on language learners, student-teacher relationships, language assessment, classroom management, professional development, teacher research, professional service, leadership, and teacher well-being. So these are the 10 chapters from 37, 40 different countries around the world where the participants are in the cases. Each of the cases has 5 keywords, as you saw today, 3 pre-reading reflections, and then the case itself, which are the stories that have about 650 words each, Then there are 5 questions. You saw examples of the discussion questions that can be used, and the facilitator guide shows how those questions can be used for assignments, for in-class discussion, for online discussion. And then there's also a research dimension in the book. So there are 2 research topics attached to each case. And the research topics also indicate how that research can be done. So there's a methodology, a method suggestion for each of the topics that are given for each case. So there's 140 research topics with ideas for how to actually investigate those topics. And then finally, for each case, there are 3 resources, which are mostly open access journal articles. So each case has a lot of information, and that is times 70. Important here, I want to emphasize again that working on the cases is working with stories. It's these stories, these experiences, hypothetical in this case, made up stories of these participants and these people living their stories in the cases, and the teachers living their stories through the narrators in the cases. Just have a quick look at, this is from chapter 1. You can have a look at those titles quickly, just for fun. You see, look at the countries that they come from. You could see on the end, high school, university, primary school, a college, a rural high school, a private language school, using AI, translanguaging, global Englishes, teaching in large classrooms. And then from chapter 9 on leadership, decolonizing the curriculum, Colombia, mentoring an ambitious novice language teacher in Iran, and so on. And then finally, that's my weekend. Okay, thank you. That's all from me. I know I didn't leave time for questions, but I'm available to hang on if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Thank you very much, Gary. Actually, we have a 15-minute break, so we can take that time for questions and any comments from the audience. But before, I would like to express my sincere thanks for your compelling plenary presentation, Gary. Thank you very much. I especially appreciated the way you illustrated the processes and practical applications of narrative inquiry and the case method in language education. Your rich examples made the concept of case and also as accessible and highlighted its relevance, not only as a research tool, but also as a meaningful strategy for teacher development. So thank you very much, Gary. And now, okay, we're going to use the time of the break. So do you have any comments or questions? I can see Arturo's hands up, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you very much, Dr. Barkhuizen. Definitely a lot of information, and very, 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 very helpful to me right now, because I am conducting a study where I am thinking, where I'm actually developing the methodology with narrative inquiry. Now, I do have a small doubt, because you did mention that within the semi-structured interview, we can hear perhaps a story, and that story can be analyzed for narrative inquiry. Would you advise to go back a second time, perhaps for a second interview with the participant, to focus on that story only, or can we just obtain the information from the extract from the first time semi-structured interview?
How many people are you interviewing? How many participants?
8.
8, yeah. That's it, yeah. So I think a second interview is always a good idea, because after the first interview, when you analyze the first interview, there will always be things you discover that you would like to find out more about. You would not only for clarification, but you'd like to explore a little bit further. And if you do come across a story in the first interview, maybe that story is satisfying as it is, but maybe you'd want it depends what you're finding with everybody, but maybe it's a story you would want to expand on a little bit more. What I always find useful that's why I asked you how many participants you have. What I always find useful is if you've got 8 participants and you can do the first round of interviews with all of them. I know it's not possible always, but if you can with all of them or most of them, and then analyze those interviews, what's really useful is after that first round of analysis, you come up with a number of themes, say, maybe, something, you'll get many themes, but maybe some important ones, and then take those important themes to the second round of interviews for everybody. So you can explore those important themes in more depth for everybody, if you think it's relevant for everybody in the second round of interviews. So as well as exploring further individual experiences of the participants. So you're doing 2 things in the second interview. You're continuing with the life experiences of that particular participant, but you're also exploring some common themes that have come out from your analysis of the first round of interviews. Because sometimes you find these themes coming up in the first round of interviews and say, oh, I wonder if it applies to the other participants, and then you're not doing any more interviews, and you've wasted the opportunity. So if you can take those themes back not only to the participant where you've seen the themes for the first time, but to other participants as well, that's quite useful.
Thank you very much. So I will do so, and didn't think about that, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely
possible. Yeah,
it's possible. Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Arturo. Okay, now, Graciela Arismendi, do you have a question?
Yes, but it would be better that Noemi starts because she's one of our students. So I give the chance first to her, if that is okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Noemi.
Thank you very much. I also am working with the narrative frames, and I guess it's also related to the narrative inquiry, because something that I encountered during the research is that participants sometimes are short in their answers. And since we are not supposed to lead the interviews or to lead the information to avoid being biased, how can we help our participants to develop a little bit more? Because, for instance, as I mentioned in the narrative frames, I receive very short answers. And that's a concern, because I conducted some instructor interviews later, but yet I feel that the narratives were something that I couldn't work a lot with. What advice could you give me?
How many participants do you have?
I had 5 participants.
5. Why were you using narrative frames for 5 participants? Because because often, I'm interested to know what you were asking them in the narrative frames, because if it's only 5 participants, why can't you just ask them face to face? Why get them to write a frame? Why not just ask them? Narrative frames are usually used for many more participants. When you've got a lot of participants, if you're going to interview them anyway, ask them face to face and record it, and then you can ask them to say more when you're speaking to them face to face. Because some of my students get excited about narrative frame. They say, yeah, I want to use narrative frame. I say, what are you going to ask them? Where are you from? And we'll ask them. Just ask them face to face. Why do you have to have a narrative frame to ask them where they're from? And then when you ask them where they're from, they can tell you, so how long have you lived there? And why are you living here now? So then you can have the conversation where you can generate stories. The frame is writing, it's hard work. Students they don't like doing that. But if you have a conversation, you can talk more, you can encourage them, say a bit more about that. Why did you do that? Oh, tell me why that happened. Why didn't you go there? It's much easier than doing a narrative frame just because you want to use a narrative frame.
Okay, yeah, well, the first reason I used them is because my participants were in a different location, and it was a way to prepare for the interview.
That's then I understand. And so then when you have the interview, you could say on the narrative frame, you said this. Oh, now can you tell me a little more about that? What did you mean by this? So use the narrative frame as a stimulus for your interview. So don't have the narrative frame and then file it. Use that in your interview. They say, oh, you said this. Can you say a bit more? Your answer was quite short here. Like bring it up and say, this was a bit short. Let's say a little bit more here. Oh, and then you jump to this topic. What did you say? Well, why did you mean this in your narrative frame? And then from there, from a question in the frame, you can go on to the interview, and then you can come back to the frame. So integrate the two in your interview.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we have time for a quick question. So Jasenia, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I am currently using narrative inquiry for my methodology in my MA study. And now that you talk about the case method, I find it so interesting. And I would like to ask, how can reflective tasks be used in the case method? You mentioned reflective pre-readings. Are there any other reflective tasks that can be used?
Well, in the case method, the case itself is where the reflection takes place, right? So there's the written case, 600 words, 650 words, and then the questions and any other tasks that the teacher, educator, or the facilitator may design around the case is what encourages the reflection. So the cases could also be used for research purposes. So that's why I've included those research topics. But those research topics are meant to inspire a different study. But the cases themselves could be, or a case that you may write, for example, you could write a case and you could take it to a research participant and say, let's have a look at this case together. Does this apply to you? Do you think the teacher in this case is similar to your experience? How is your experience different from the teacher in this case? So it's this is a methodology I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've never used it. But it's having a narrative case with a dilemma and so on, and then taking it as a research tool to a research participant and say how, and then using it to reflect off the participants' experiences. So how would you react to this? What would you do in this case? Are you the same? Do you see yourself in this way, or do you see yourself differently? So instead of just you and the participant having a conversation, have the case as a sort of mediation tool between the researcher and the participant. Work through the case to get the stories generated from the participant. I think it will work fabulously. I haven't done it myself, but it's something I've been meaning to do.
Okay. Well, one last thing. I would like to ask everybody, please turn on your camera so I can take a beautiful screenshot with Professor Gary Barkhuizen. So let's do it quickly, please. Yes, do your hair, get ready, and okay. Donatico, Lisette, Gloria, Ikram, Irlanda, Marcela, Diego, Irais. Okay, so let's do it. 1, 2, and 3. Smile. One more, please. One more. 1, 2, and 3. All right. So, Professor Gary Barkhuizen, thank you very much. I am really grateful to you for this lovely presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope to all see you at some point again, hopefully in Mexico.
Yes.
Bye-bye, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Have a successful seminar. Bye-bye.
Bye.